It's a pleasure to join you. Wasn't that a great presentation, Dr. Acevedo? Thank you very much. I was nervous about the landing before you spoke. Now I'm just terrified. I want to thank you all for inviting me to come and speak with you and give you a few minutes of my perspective on Mars and our space program in general, and then I'd love to open it up for your questions and comments. Tomorrow is going to be an incredible day for JPL, for NASA, for the United States, and for all of humanity. Curiosity's entry, descent, and landing in Gale Crater is a culmination of nearly a decade's work by thousands of people here at JPL and around the world. And that's before Curiosity's science mission even begins. And the whole world will be along for the ride. Many of you may remember when Spirit, the first of the Mars exploration rovers, landed in January of 2004. The servers at JPL and NASA crashed under the onslaught of millions who were anxious to see the newest pictures from Mars. 4 years ago, I was in Islamabad, Pakistan, when the Mars Phoenix landed. Despite all of Pakistan's crushing problems, despite the often strained relationship between Washington and Islamabad, despite the fact that for many of Pakistan's millions, space is even more remote and forbidding than it is for us, the story was the lead in the local newspapers and on Pakistani television. The reaction in Pakistan to a smaller mission that had been far less heavily publicized confirmed to me that humanity is bound together by an interest in space, and that even people with far less than us can share in the wonderment and thrill of exploration. 43 years ago last month, as Apollo 11 lifted off for the moon, Walter Cronkite mused that it was as if we were sitting on the dock watching Columbus sail off into the Atlantic 500 years before. In the heady summer of 1969, all things seemed possible. Moon bases, space stations, trips to Mars and the outer planets, and all just over the horizon. But as the European exploration of the New World played out over centuries, our conquest of the heavens has played out over decades, not years. Experience, heartbreak, failure have tempered our earliest hopes, and we have for too long drifted without a strategic vision for space that has survived changes of administration as well as congressional appropriations cycles. Now, even as we prepare to celebrate Curiosity's arrival on Mars, we must face the urgent need to set new goals and to reinvigorate the space program. I hope and expect that Curiosity will not only excite the world, but it will focus our national attention on our space program. As many of you know, I'm a big supporter not only of JPL and the planetary science program, but of the full gamut of our endeavors in space, scientific, robotic, and manned. I believe that the quest for knowledge is part of who we are as human beings. We are compelled to investigate the unknown. And a logical goal is Mars for all of the reasons that have compelled us to embark on the decades-long robotic study of the red planet that has led to this day. As President Kennedy noted in 1961, proposing the moon landing, going to Mars will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. It is an attainable goal, but one that will require a marshaling of talent that our space program has not seen in decades. One key component of that talent pool are the engineers and scientists at JPL, who make up the world's most specialized workforce, the team that designs, flies, and lands space probes on other planets. That is a group that, once broken up, cannot easily be reconstituted. And it will require a marshaling of financial resources and political commitment at a time when both are in short supply. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Dr. Neil deGrasse Tyson's efforts to get the space agency 1 penny for every tax dollar instead of currently the half cent it gets. I had the pleasure of speaking at a lunch with him on the Hill several months ago, and luckily I spoke before he did. And he makes a compelling case for reinvigorating NASA and the space program. His is an argument with which I wholeheartedly agree. And I believe you do as well. But without a defined goal on which the various stakeholders, NASA, Congress, the White House, the science community, industry, and the American public can agree, a rebirth of the American space program cannot take place. And this is where you come in. By joining the Mars Society, you've joined the ranks of the explorers, and the government needs to hear your voices. You need to write, to email, to call, to visit, to petition for an increase in NASA's budget, as well as a national commitment to lead an effort to put humans on Mars by a date certain. Without persistence and clarity, we will continue to drift. Again, history is instructive here. In the years before he set sail for the Americas, Columbus went hat in hand to various European monarchs looking for a sponsor. It took several years before Spain's Ferdinand and Isabella agreed to fund his voyages. Doggedness paid off in the end, so do not be discouraged. As you know, the NASA Mars Replan study that is being led by Orlando Figueroa is due out in August. If reports are accurate, the group will lay out a pathway to a manned landing sometime potentially in the 2030s, with a robotic sample return sometime in the decade before that. Your reaction to that plan will be vital in helping to shape the path ahead. As for me, I want NASA to think big. I want us to continue to build on what has certainly been one of the most productive scientific endeavors ever undertaken, and to continue planning launches at as many available launch opportunities as possible. I believe that the space program is a dramatic catalyst for a range of new technologies in which America can be a world leader. It is not an accident that in this area, in the shadow of JPL and Caltech, we are filled with startup companies doing all kinds of incredible things. Finally, before I open it up for questions, I'd like to update you on the current status of the NASA budget and specifically the Mars program. President Obama's budget request for 2013, which was unveiled in February, keeps NASA's overall budget flat at $17.7 billion. The request cut NASA's planetary science funding from $1.5 billion to $1.2 billion, with further reductions expected in coming years. The Mars program got hit particularly hard, with funding dropping from $587 million this year to $360 million in 2013, then falling to just $189 million in 2015. This would be a disaster. As many of you know, I have worked with Chairman Frank Wolf, Ranking Member Fatah, my colleague John Culberson, and Senators Mikulski and Feinstein to push back on these terribly ill-considered cuts. And our efforts have met with some success. The House Appropriations Committee has approved a NASA budget at $17.6 billion, and on the same day, the Senate Appropriations Committee adopted a plan for Commerce, Justice, and Science to give the space agency $19.4 billion. The House bill restored $88 million in cuts to Mars, and the Senate bill added $100 million to planetary science. But we still have a long way to go. And it is my hope that as we go to conference, when we go to conference, if we go to conference, that we can increase those numbers further beyond the proposal in either the House or Senate. Last week, a framework agreement was announced that, if enacted, would keep the government funded at the current level for another 6 months. This is called a continuing resolution. Under the terms of that resolution, there will be some across-the-board cut to meet the goals set by Congress and the President last summer during the debt ceiling crisis. The impact on Mars will depend on how NASA allocates funds in the operating plan to start the new fiscal year. And how NASA treats Mars in the operating plan will be consistent with the guidance it's given from the Office of Management and Budget. The bottom line is, the immediate future is murky, and we need your help. The only thing that has rescued us from the severity of what the administration proposed was the fact that planetary scientists like you have been making their voices heard, and loudly. And I think, frankly, it has astounded the administration that you have spoken with such boldness and clarity. Why is Mars being cut? Why is one of the most successful scientific endeavors in history being savaged? Is it because the program has been a failure? Plainly not. Is it because the NASA budget itself has been dramatically cut? Actually, no. The NASA budget is fairly flat. So why is Mars being singled out? I asked the administrator this question during a hearing, and his answer, I have to say, was bewildering. It was, well, Mars has done really well. Well, what kind of an answer is that? Yes, let's punish success with drastic cuts. Let's reward failure elsewhere with massive increases. That is no logical strategy either as a management technique or a plan for the future. The only conclusion I can reach about why Mars was proposed to be cut and planetary science was proposed to be cut so significantly is because they thought they could. Because they thought the outcry would be so muted. Who are planetary scientists anyway, when compared with some of the major commercial players? But they have been astounded at the fury of the pushback. And that is the only thing that has saved us thus far. So I want to come here today and tell you to keep it up. This is too important to be silent now, because the decisions we make now will have consequences for decades. I feel like you do, that we are this close to discovering the building blocks of life on another planet. And I feel like just as we step up to the very precipice of these really mind-shattering developments, the administration is telling us, step back. Don't think so big anymore. We can't do the big anymore. We can't do the great anymore. Let's let the Europeans take the lead. I find this so incredibly short-sighted, and I'm being polite here, so incredibly short-sighted in terms of the nation's leadership and in terms of our future. I'm at a lot of loss of words. We have seen in the difficulty in going back to our heavy lift rockets and those technologies now many decades old, that if we step back from Mars now, it may be decades before we can put the talent together again to go back and land on Mars. I don't want the history of this period of our nation's history to be written that we got this close to a major discovery only to retreat for decades. So what we do now is of critical importance. What we do now will set the trajectory not only for Mars, but for planetary science, and even more broadly than that, for America's scientific leadership in the world. So thank you for organizing yourselves. Thank you for the strength of your voices, and keep it up, and we will succeed. Thank you. Yes, sir.
One question. When you advocate for space in your career in Congress, and from what I've heard you say, isn't it fair to say that if you want an economy built to last, this space exploration, in particular the synergy of space exploration with green technology, ought to be a central tenet of how that economy built to last comes about? What do you think?
Well, and could you hear the question all right? No. Okay. Well, the question is, when we advocate in Congress for planetary science and the Mars program, isn't part and parcel of that argument the fact that if we want an economy built to last, we have to maintain a position of leadership in space, in science and technology? And the answer is absolutely. We are in a small, hyper-competitive global economy now. We are not going to be able to compete in that economy on the basis of who can pay their people the least. We will always lose that fight. The only way we can compete and win is the way historically we have, and that is by being the most productive, the most inventive people on the globe. And you can't do that without investing in education. You can't do that without investing in science. And the dramatic breakthroughs that this program has had and the transfer of technology this program has had has been one of the things that has maintained our leadership in the face of this globalization. So you're absolutely right. I'll tell you a little bit about the arguments I counter on the other side, just so you have a sense of what we're dealing with in Congress. In In a good economy, we hear this argument somewhat. In a bad economy, we hear it quite frequently, and that is, we have so many unmet needs here on the ground. Why are we spending money on Mars? Now, the premise of that question is that somehow we are like we have a negative balance of trade with the planet of Mars. That we are doing giveaways to the Martians or something. And I try to remind my colleagues that we are not spending money on Mars, we are spending it on Earth. And we're spending the vast majority of that here in the United States, and frankly a lot of it here in California. So it's not as if that money is actually being spent off planet. But more than that, as the gentleman pointed out, this has brought us so many dividends economically. And this is also an area where, frankly, it is an unmitigated positive around the globe, which is the reason I give the Islamabad example. I'm on the Intelligence Committee, and I can tell you in Islamabad, there ain't much we do that is well thought of. But around the globe, people look to American leadership with awe and inspiration. And that is not something to give away in these difficult times. But I think you're absolutely right. There's an economic imperative here. Yes?
Some have said in conversations around here that, oh, let's let the free market take space. Let's just let it happen organically without a leadership and a vision coming from a higher entity or a larger entity, that's the government and our national will and our national collective beliefs. Can you address this push-pull between private and public? I mean, there's a place for both. But the free market can't do this direction.
Yes, I'd be happy to. The question is, some might argue that let the free market control. Let the free market do this. But isn't there, a place both for the private sector and the public sector here? Are there some things where you still need NASA leadership? You still need government leadership? And the answer is absolutely. And in fact, I think it makes a great deal of sense to tap the private sector to help us with commercial crew. Let the private sector play a bigger role in the things that we have done now for a very long time. Let NASA focus on the things that are really hard, not to say that a manned trip to the space station is easy, but let NASA do the things we haven't done yet. And this is something that the private sector cannot do on its own. I mean, what is the profit motive in trying a manned mission to Mars? There may be one day, and in fact, as we see the growth of the space tourism industry, that's a wonderful thing. But the space tourism industry isn't an industry about going to Mars yet, although give Elon Musk time and he'll get there. But both public and private sector have important roles to play, and frankly, allowing the private sector to do more cost-effectively some of the things that we have been able to do for some time frees up resources for the really hard things like Mars. But if we're serious about a manned mission to Mars, and if we're serious about doing this in the lifetime of any of the people in this room, then we have to be serious about the robotic explorations now, because we're not sending people there until we are very sure, at least to the degree we can be, that there's a way to do this safely. And that doesn't mean one sample return mission. I think that's going to mean multiple missions, which is going to mean multiple opportunities, and there just aren't that many between now and the 2030s if we're really serious about this. And I hate to see happen under this administration what happened under the last, which is a bold vision is announced, and none of the funding is provided, and none of the vision for the intermediate steps necessary to get there takes place. Yes?
You're here obviously sort of preaching to the choir about these things, so perhaps we could be a little bit more self-critical. And in that regard, I want to mention two things I think you and your colleagues could really do to help, and then ask you a question. The two things you could do to help are, in terms of the public-private partnerships and what can the public sector and the government do. One thing they could do is restructure it so that long-term investments are more attractive to the private sector. Right now we have way too much focus on this quarter's profits or tomorrow's profits or the microsecond trading. So that's one thing you guys have to get straight, because there's no way to run an economy in the long term. The other thing is that we have a problem with ITAR and immigration policy. Half the people I work with at NASA the brightest are foreign students, and we're going to force them to go home with their knowledge, whether they want to or not. And that's just so silly. They want to stay here and work in the U.S. on Mars and stuff like that, and we're really being horrible to them. And the last thing is self-criticism in the space community. One of the reasons that the Mars budget was cut was because of cost overruns and schedule slips with the Senate launch system and with the James Webb Telescope and with, Curiosity. And so we're going to have to do some things to fix that. And so I'm just wondering if you could address those.
I'll be happy to try, and I'm, with your indulgence, not going to repeat the entirety of the question, but the question involved three things. One, the sometimes short-term nature of the necessity of corporate profits for shareholders, limiting the long-term vision in terms of the private sector. A second question was about immigration, export control, and the particular problem about how difficult it is to get brilliant people to come here, to get a visa to come here or stay here to work on these projects. And the third issue was the problem of cost overruns and the necessity of dealing with that and the role that plays in some of the difficulties facing the Mars program. So let me address those very quickly. In terms of the private sector, that is certainly an issue. As shareholders demand payoffs now, as executives and companies need to show results now to the market. I'm frankly very circumspect about how much we can do about that, but in the category of let's be self-critical, frankly, those of us in Congress are not in a position to throw stones at the private sector because we can't even plan in a 2-year cycle. And so, for programs like this that are years, if not decades in the making, having not only a vision, a space vision that can transcend administrations but can actually get through a 2-year period of Congress has been a problem. And that's a problem entirely laid at our feet. And I can't justify it in any manner whatsoever. I think it is appalling. It is appalling. And all I can say is it's got to change. And your efforts to corral those of us in Congress to get our act together are going to be vital. Because what we are doing now on so many levels is completely inexplicable. And frankly, this is a metaphor for the broader problem, and that is whatever problems we're having in the space program, whatever problems we're having with the budget and our deficit and debt, these are man-made problems because the talent is all here in this country, not only for a phenomenally successful space program, but to actually have a phenomenally successful country. On the point of visas and immigration, this is a real problem in the effort to make it more difficult post 9/11 for the wrong people to get here who mean us harm. We have made it more difficult for the right people who mean us well to get here. I've actually introduced a bill on this subject called the INVEST Act to deal with a particular problem in Caltech where you have brilliant students come from all over the world, get advanced degrees in math, science, engineering, and technology, and then want to stay and start a company, add to our economy, create jobs, and what do? We kick them the heck out. That's crazy. That's economic suicide. So I've introduced a bill to establish a new visa program that says you graduate with an advanced degree here, you want to stay, we want you to stay. We want you to stay. And finally, in terms of the cost overruns, these are a problem in any project that's difficult, and we've learned a lot, and a lot we've learned the very hard way. As a member of the Intel Committee, I've seen a lot of waste in cost overruns. We've seen it in the space program as well. James Webb may yet break the $8 billion ceiling, and that has sucked a lot of the oxygen out of the room, the entire space room. And this is a problem. I think here at JPL, we have learned from the cost overruns and put steps into effect to make it far less likely to happen. Sometimes even with the best of processes and the best of efforts, we're going to have overruns because, frankly, we are trying to do things that haven't been done before. And there is a certain imponderable when you're trying to develop a technology that has just never been done. But I think we are getting better at this, and we have to get better at this, and I never want to see what took place with James Webb ever take place again, because it just kills too much of planetary science. Thank you very much.